Ruth chapter 4, very near the end of the book of Ruth. And simply by way of reminder, just skipping across the pond, so to speak, with this, I want you to look at verse 5 of chapter 4. Boaz is talking with the nearer kinsman, and he says, on the day that you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you must also acquire Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of the deceased, in order to raise up the name of the deceased of his inheritance. And what I want to focus on just a moment, it's something that's unlike our culture, but it's very common in the ancient Near East, and that is the name, raise up a name. Of course, it's not literal. It's that name there is a designation for the memory of a person, the personification or the picture of the deeds and the achievements, the honor and the reputation of that person. So in this sense, it is a virtual equivalent to posterity or descendants. One of the most fearful curses that one could invoke on another in this culture here was, may your seed perish and your name die out. That was just the ugliest thing you could say to someone in this day. And there's a couple of examples in 1 Samuel chapter 24 and verse 21. 1 Samuel 24 and verse 21. The text says, "So now swear to me by the Lord that you will not cut off my descendants after me, and that you will not destroy my name from my father's household." This is Saul talking to David. Saul here, in a rare moment of true confession, confesses to David that, I know that the Lord has anointed you. I know that you're going to be king. When you become king, swear to me by the Lord that you will not cut off my descendants. Don't wipe my family out completely so that there's no one left that bears my name. That's what he's asking, just to give you an idea of how important it was in the people of this day in the ancient Near East. 2 Samuel 14:7 and 2 Samuel 18:18 are also statements in this way, stating this. We're going to see this again in verse 10, this thing about a name. But that's very important in the mind of the ancient Near East people. So what Boaz approached the near kinsman and said that when you buy the field from Naomi, you must also acquire Ruth. You acquire her, the widow of the deceased, in order to carry on the family name, carry on the reputation, the posterity, the achievements, and everything is wrapped up in all of that. You must do that. And that was the thing that challenged him, because he responded in verse 6 with, I cannot redeem it for myself. When he heard that, he was seemingly all ready to do this until he heard that Ruth comes along with the package, and then he backed out. But this in verse 6, when he says, I cannot redeem it for myself, the question is how could the addition of Ruth threaten the relative's estate? Why would it jeopardize, in this context here, why would it destroy or ruin or seriously damage? And it's not clear how acquiring Ruth and producing an heir for Elimelech would ruin his relatives, this nearer relative's inheritance. It's true that the child would eventually inherit Elimelech's land, but before that happened, the relative would have been able to enjoy the produce of the land in exchange for taking care of Ruth, Naomi, and the child, if a child was born. He also had to factor in, this man had to factor in, and since the whole town knew of Ruth's reputation, it would be a little bit of a stretch to think that they were not aware that Ruth had no child. Did everybody know that Ruth had been married for years with no child? We don't know that for sure. The town was aware of her reputation. Presumably, and they knew that she had been married before, but there was no child. So maybe this man thought, well, if it produces, if she hasn't had a baby yet, but if it produces a baby, a son, then he's going to get everything. And we'll talk a little bit about that more. But on the plus side of the nearer kinsman, she hadn't had any children. Maybe she won't have any children. This might really work out for me. But if he considered that at all, he went right past it pretty quick in verse 6 and says, I cannot redeem it for myself. So if the relative had possession of the land and it could not be taken from him in any way, or if it could be taken from him only by reimbursing him for his purchase, then there's no conceivable way that his estate could be seriously threatened by the transaction at all. More likely, the situation here is that the repurchase of the land of Elimelech from a third party is what needed to take place. This type of redemption gave the relative neither an unconditional nor a reimbursable right to the possession and the usage of the redeemed land. So it's likely here that Elimelech loaned the land out for rent of some sort, some arrangement to a third party, rather than somebody in his own family, is what it appears that took place here. So again, as we summarized last week, putting all this together, Boaz convenes a legal assembly in chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, informs the nearer kinsman that Naomi is surrendering her right to the field of Elimelech. He does that in verse 3. And as the widow of the deceased, she has the legal right of using and enjoying the fruits or profits of the land belonging to her husband as long as she lives. But since the land stands in need of redemption, somebody needs to purchase it, and she has neither the means nor the legal standing to do that, she is surrendering her rights to the nearer kinsman, who is also the eventual heir, since Elimelech, Mahlon, and Chilion have all died without children. So he would stand to inherit Elimelech's land, which would have gone to his two boys. His two boys died, and they left no boys. So he stands to inherit all of this land. But if he takes Ruth, and Ruth has a boy, he's going to lose it. Because then it would go to Ruth's boy to carry on Elimelech's name. That's what he's not willing to do. Too great a risk. Work this land all these years and then hand it over after I've worked this land? Evidently, he's not willing to do that. So Boaz publicly calls the kinsman to take on the voluntary family responsibility of marrying Ruth and of producing descendants for the deceased on his inheritance. This man is now caught in an ethical and an economic dilemma. And he has three options to choose from. One, while not legally bound, he could accept moral responsibility for Elimelech's estate. He could redeem the field, marry Ruth, and ensure everyone of their well-being. Naomi would be taken care of, Ruth would be taken care of. And it's certainly an honorable course of action. Number two, he could reject the offer and surrender the rights to the land and the responsibility of raising up a name of the deceased to Boaz. And this move would not necessarily have been irresponsible. After all, Boaz intimated his interest in assuming the role of redeemer by declaring that he was next in line. Verse 4, he did that. You're the nearer kinsman. I'm next. I'm right after you. I'm asking you, what do you want to do? So the nearer kinsman is not thinking, man, that you just caught me at a bad time and you really put me in a corner here. You've made it so that the well-being of these two widows hangs on me, and if I don't choose yes in this situation, they're going to die of starvation. It's not that, because he's already stated in verse 4, I'm the next one in line, but do you want to do it? Is what he's saying. Number three, he could accept the responsibility of a redeemer and acquire the field, but reject the responsibility of marrying Ruth and yield to Boaz the moral obligation or the right to marry Ruth. This would doubtless have cost him considerably in terms of respect and honor in the community. in the short range, and in the long range terms could have proved economically uncertain. Because if Boaz could produce an heir, then he would even lose that land as well. So they go through this. He says, I can't do it in verse 6. Verse 7, this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning the redemption of the exchange of land. To confirm any matter, a man removed his sandal and gave it to another, and this was the manner of attestation in Israel. So the purpose of this legal gesture is to confirm or to put into effect any matter that was being addressed. That was the manner of attestation or legalization in Israel, as it says. So with the transfer of the sandal, the official court proceedings were completed. The relative in relinquishing or handing over his rights, he disappears from history. We never hear from him ever again. And now we come to verses 9 and 10, where Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witnesses today that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. Moreover, I have acquired Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of Mahlon, to be my wife, in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance, so that the name of the deceased will not be cut off from his brothers or from the court of his birthplace. You are witnesses today. So, following this proceeding, Boaz summons the elders and all the people, it says. Evidently, there was a crowd that had gathered around here. Anytime these kind of proceedings went on, it's likely a crowd would begin to gather. All the people to witness this event. And notice here that Boaz begins and ends with the call to witness. The very part of verse 9, you are witnesses today. The last four words of verse 10, you are witnesses today. So it begins and ends with the call to witness. And remember, at this time, this was an oral culture. Visual and verbal affirmation was binding. You all saw it. You were here. He makes that statement at the beginning and at the end of his small speech here. The legal assembly at the city's gate served to underscore the legality of the transition. And as we noted, a crowd had gathered when Boaz called the elders. That attracted the people. If ever in the future a question arises, he could produce the sandal, and he could call several witnesses at the same time to settle the matter. And you note also, not only does he begin and end with a call to witness, but the word today is used twice in verses 9 and 10. You are witnesses today that I have done these things. Last word of verse 10, you are witnesses today. So Boaz is very selective about his words. He's very careful about what he says here. This is binding, and nobody is going to wiggle their way through this. So Boaz kept his word to Ruth. That word is in chapter 3, verse 13. And in fulfillment to Naomi's word in chapter 3, verse 18. Boaz will present Mahlon's widow, Ruth, as a legitimate link in the chain of acquisitions and family lineage. You see the term moreover. Now, was that first word in verse 10, moreover? In this context here, that word moreover is a marker of sequential addition. In addition to buying the land from, as it says in verse 9, I have acquired Ruth. That's the way we should understand that conjunction there, moreover. In addition to buying the land, where he says in verse 9, verse 10, moreover, I have acquired Ruth. The word acquired there has a broad range. Eve names her son Cain, explaining that I have gained, I have acquired. a male child in Genesis chapter 4 and verse 1. The word also refers to God's possession of heaven and earth in Abram's oath. I swear to the Lord, God Most High, Creator. And there's your word acquired. Kana is the word, it's translated creator in Genesis 14:22. Creator of heaven and earth, as well as it does refer to God's acquisition of the people Israel in Exodus chapter 15 and verse 6. So sometimes the feminist commentators will look at this and say, well, this word acquired makes it seem like she's just a piece of property, and that's just the patriarchal times in which we're living in, and thank God we don't live like that today, and Ruth did her part to emancipate women, and it's just ridiculous. The word acquired does not imply that they purchased a loaf of bread and took it home. That's not what it says. It's not. That's why I give you all of these usages of it. It doesn't mean that. In fact, chapter 4 and verse 5 of Proverbs, acquire wisdom, acquire discernment. There you have the word there. So he acquired, he purchased, he bought the rights, and that's the word used here. Now, if this would have been Naomi rather than Ruth, the nearer kinsman may have taken the offer because Naomi was much less likely to produce an heir. But when you add Ruth to the equation there, the chances of her having a baby, even though she hadn't had one yet, the chances of having a male child, an heir, is greater. And he saw that and he backed off. It's probably the reason why he backed off. And again, he wasn't in a corner. Naomi and Ruth were not going to starve. Boaz was right in line, right behind him. Perhaps that gave him an out, so to speak, in that. What is Boaz's motivation in all this? Well, verse 13 gives 3 reasons. First, in order to raise up the name of the deceased of his inheritance. And that's identical to verse 5 that we saw earlier. The legal oath here in verses 9 and 10 expands his earlier words to the nearer relative. Those words were back in verses 3 through 5. So you have an expansion here of verses 3 through 5 by, number 1, identifying all of Elimelech's property, not just the field, as the objects of purchase. And 2, naming Ruth's deceased husband. And 3, adding a fuller explanation of his purpose in making the purchase. So as he explains it in verses 3 through 5, he gives greater detail in verses 9 and 10 by identifying all of Elimelech's property, naming Ruth's deceased husband, and adding a fuller explanation to his purpose in making the purchase. So that's the first motivation that we see in the text, in order to raise up the name of the deceased of his inheritance. The second reason listed here, so that the name of the deceased may not be cut off from his brothers. You notice back in verse 9 you had the word name. Here in verse 10, twice already you have name. In order to raise up the name, so that the name of the deceased may not be cut off. It's a big deal in this ancient Near Eastern culture. Progeny is a huge deal. Huge deal. And you know the Old Testament, you know that in Chronicles and Nehemiah and Numbers, and Genesis 11, there are extensive genealogies. As well as Luke 1 and Matthew 1 as well. Extensive genealogies. Because that was important. You had to know who was from what tribe and who they were in order to identify, to have the right credentials to be the Messiah. And that's why Matthew and Luke list the genealogy. Here is proof that Jesus is the Messiah. Look at the genealogical line, and he follows that. That's the reason, one of the reasons why Matthew and Luke includes that as a confirmation that this man is who he says he is. So the second reason here is so that the name may not be cut off from his brothers. And this is one of several expressions of annihilating one's honor and reputation and preventing one's existence to continue on. There's a couple of examples to show you. In Joshua chapter 7 and verse 9. Joshua 7:9. The text says this, "For the Canaanites and all the inhabitants of the land will hear of it, and they will surround us and cut off our name from the earth. And what will you do for your great name?" There is the concern expressed there. This is Joshua speaking to God. Cut off our name from the earth, as if we never existed. Isaiah chapter 14 and verse 22 is another place. Isaiah 14:22. And this he did to the Babylonians. The Lord says, I will rise up against them, declares the Lord of hosts, and will cut off from Babylon name and survivors, offspring and posterity, declares the Lord. And indeed he did. The Babylonians, so far as we know today, do not exist. They've been either all destroyed or subsumed under something else, and their name is gone. So this is the second motive that he has. The third motive is from the court of his high place. That's a designation for the town, Bethlehem. Literally, the gate of his place. So Elimelech and Mahlon, through an heir from Boaz and Ruth, will be presented in the gathering at the gate. They will represent him. Mr. Almoni Poloni will disappear without a name, but the security of Elimelech's and Mahlon's name is granted. That's the major concern. It's foreign to us for the most part, and I think it would be an interesting study for you to do a little personal Bible study. Get out the Bible dictionaries and the encyclopedias and look up family, because Hebrew Jewish families are organized according to clan, tribe, and they have about 4 or 5 categories. And you start from there, you branch out to reputation, inheritance, things like that, and you start realizing that it was a major drive in the things that they did. They did not, as Saul said to David, please do not cut off my name, do not destroy all my descendants. And David, of course, he didn't. Remember, there was one who was left from Saul's family. Do you remember who that was? Mephibosheth, who at some point fell and crippled himself. But David honored his word and took care of Mephibosheth for the remainder of his days. So that's the statement that Boaz makes to everyone. And he calls for the witness at the beginning and the end. And here's the public reaction in verses 11 and 12. And that's as far as we'll get today is verses 11 and 12. Here's the public reaction. And all the people who were in the court and the elders said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, both of whom built the house of Israel, and may you achieve wealth in Ephrathah and become famous in Bethlehem. Moreover, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, through the offspring which the Lord will give you by this young woman. Everybody is familiar with her reputation. They seem to be thrilled and very much okay with how things are going and what's going to happen to her and to Boaz. Now, Boaz is, in all the indications that we see, here there's hints that Boaz is older than Naomi. He seems to be closer to Naomi's age than to Ruth's age. But there's no indication, did his wife pass away? Did he never marry? It's very odd for a Jewish man to not be married. He would want to be married. He would want to produce children. He would desire to do that, but the writer here gives us no indication at all whether Boaz's wife perhaps had passed away, but we don't know. So the benediction here in verses 11 and 12, it consists of 3 parts. The people express their concern for Boaz with a prayer for Ruth in their statement. And the request is remarkable because they place Ruth, who is a foreigner, remember this, so a foreigner from Moab, among the matriarchs of Israel. They place her on the same line as Rachel and Leah. Rachel and Leah are the ancestresses of the 12 tribes of Israel. From them came the 12 tribes of Israel. And they are thinking, the group of people here are thinking specifically of the matriarch's fertility, obviously. They're thinking, just as they produced the tribes of Israel, the sons of Israel, may this woman produce for you many children as well. That's in their mind. So just as Rachel and Leah have built up the house of Israel, the implication here, their statement is, may Ruth build up the house of Boaz. And that phrase, to build a house, means to have, of course it means to have children, to have descendants, to establish a family. And the second part of the blessing, may you achieve wealth or gain riches in Ephrathah and become famous or gain renown in Bethlehem. Now that phrase, may you achieve wealth, is literally act in strength. May you act in strength. It's literally what it says there. For example, the same 2 Hebrew words are used for rescuing needy people, with God as the subject. In Psalm 118 in verses 15 and 16, it's translated, does valiantly. Some words are hard for a southerner to say. B, or another place where this 2 Hebrew words are used, or achieving military success in Numbers 24 and 1 Samuel 14 and verse 48. Another way it's used is accomplishing a variety of beneficial tasks for one's family. The deeds of the ideal wife are in view in Proverbs chapter 31 and verse 29. And it also means, in context, acquiring wealth, such as Deuteronomy chapter 8 and verses 17 and 18. So the 2 Hebrew words can fit, and you find them in all of these different contexts here. Rescuing needy people, achieving military success, accomplishing a variety of beneficial tasks, and acquiring wealth. So when we come to the context here, which sense comes out here? What is the intention of the author here? I believe the acquiring wealth is the closest, that 4th nuance there is the closest to the idea expressed in the people's blessings when they say this, which this blessing envisioned Boaz through the children produced by Ruth attaining wealth and the prestige and the security that comes with children, that comes with the family. In this culture, where children were viewed as an economic asset and as a source of security in this culture. If you didn't have children, you couldn't work the land. And if you didn't work the land, you may not eat. Which is very similar to the way the United States was in its early days. Very similar. And in the last 40 years has slowly diminished. I don't know if you remember, several years ago, there was the concerts that they used to have to save the small farms. They used to have rallies because the small farms were slowly being eaten up economically. They just couldn't compete with the people that had thousands of acres of lands. Those people that had 200 or 300, 400 acres couldn't compete with those. And so here in the United States, they would have concerts to raise money so that these smaller farms could stay in existence. Well, this is the time in the life of Israel where if it was a blessing to have children, and children were viewed as an economic asset. So the blessing is that Boaz's name live on in his descendants. And Bethlehem, he mentions Bethlehem here, he says, Epaphrathah and become famous or gain renown in Bethlehem. Now we know that Bethlehem has been there for a long time, and Bethlehem was always destined for greatness. Bethlehem was small in comparison to other villages, but we know that Bethlehem is in Judah, in the tribe of Judah, and it's from the tribe of Judah that is the tribe that is destined to produce the king. Genesis 49, the scepter will not depart from Judah. So the king, the ultimate king, the ultimate deliverer from sin and from the effects of sin on the earth is going to come from the tribe of Judah. So Bethlehem was always destined for greatness. The little town rose in its stature as the birthplace of David and the location of Samuel's anointing of the young shepherd boy to be Israel's second king. The third element here, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. Judah is the most important of the clans, the house of Perez. Read my notes here. May your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, the most important of the clans of Judah. The house of Perez. Of all the clans of Judah, Perez was the most important. The point of comparison must be here from the perspective of David. There's no doubt the writer is writing after David, after these events, because in verses 16 and following, he's going to give a genealogy. So David has already come and gone, and then God supernaturally directed someone to write this book about this occasion. The line of Perez was not unusually large or fruitful. It didn't have a lot of numbers that would cause it to be noticed above anything else. But this is the view of the book of Ruth, seen from the genealogy that begins with Perez, not Judah. And there's another similarity. Tamar's husband had died with no male heir, as Ruth's husband had died with no male heir. Judah was the father of Perez through Tamar, and Perez became the ancestor of the clan of Boaz. And we'll look in more detail through that when we look and see verses 20 and 21 down there. And there's the whole question, do the genealogies include everyone, or do they skip and focus on major people so that the reader can follow the line? That's an ongoing thing that people write about. If the genealogies, if every person is mentioned in the genealogy is there, they didn't skip any generations. If that is true, then people who count these genealogies would say the earth is about 4,004 years old, because they add up all these genealogies and they would go back 4,000 years or so. Or they would say 6,000 years, 4,000 years before the birth of Christ. Those who would say the genealogies at times skip generations would say even if they skip generations, the earth within fair reason is no more than 10,000 years old, max. So maybe 8,000 years before the birth of Christ. So those are the two ideas on genealogies. And it affects, but if you have a young earth view, you understand that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and he did it in 6 literal days, and there's no gap with all of this. Then you either take, it was 4,000 years before Christ, or 6,000 years, maybe 8,000 years before Christ max. So we'll see what we can do when we get there. But Perez became the ancestor of the clan of Boaz. Now, through Ruth, they prayed that Boaz would have a son and live on through his children, even as Judah lives on in his descendants. And little did the people know how prophetic their prayer, their words would be. Now, as a reminder of themes in the book of Ruth, because next week we'll look at verse 13, and you can see Boaz took Ruth, she became his wife, he went into her, and the Lord enabled her to conceive. Fascinating statement. Just a reminder that the Lord enabled her to conceive. The Lord can keep people from having children, and the Lord can enable people to have children. So he enabled her to have a baby in verse 13. And then you have the blessing through verse 15. Naomi takes the child and the neighbor in her arms, and the neighbor women gave him a name. And then you have the generations of Perez in verses 18 and following. So I believe we can finish next week. But for now, a reminder of the themes in the book of Ruth. Just a couple of reminders. First of all, the book demonstrates God's concern for needy people. You see that all over this book. God's concern for needy people. If we were to do a study, and you can do this study, God's concern for the widow, for the orphan. In fact, one of the major books in the Old Testament to go to is the book of Amos. The book of Amos has 3, 4, or 5 statements about why judgment is coming upon Israel, the northern tribes. And the reason is stated 3 or 4 or 5 times in there is because you have treated the widow with contempt. You have treated the poor with contempt. You have not defended the orphan. So several times in the book of Amos, God takes very special attention. He places very special attention on those people who cannot defend themselves. Those who can, who have the responsibility, God holds them to it. And one of the reasons Israel, the northern tribes, went into captivity because they were mistreating the poor and the widow. They were not taking care of defending the orphan. And you see that in this book here. This book demonstrates his concern for needy people. In Psalm 146 and verse 9, it states, "The Lord protects the strangers. He supports the fatherless and the widow." And this book puts that wonderful truth on full display. It shows how the Lord provided for 2 needy widows, Naomi and Ruth. Naomi had lost her husband and both her sons while living in Moab. She returned to Bethlehem, a bitter and impoverished woman who had little, if any, hope. But the Lord transformed her situation and attitude as he lifted her out of the depths of her despair. He cared for her. He provided for her. He had already included in the law some mechanism for caring for people in her situation. And 2, the Lord accomplished this through 2 people, Ruth and Boaz, who were willing to live out God's principles of loyalty and kindness. Now, God most often supplies the needs through people who are willing to do what is right and to sacrifice for the good of others. Faithfulness of people never excludes God's working in hidden and mysterious ways. It's like yeast at work in a loaf of bread. It does what it does. Even though you are kneading the dough, it's still going to do what it does. There may be some event in life that we can attribute only to the intervention of God. And likely we have testimony of that very thing. There's no doubt it was God that did this. It was completely unexpected, But more often, God is at work through everyday actions of faithful people with those around them. More often, God supplies the needs of people through the faithfulness of someone else. So this person needs something. That God most likely uses the person sitting right beside them who's aware of that need to supply the need. And that's what he did here. Through Ruth and Boaz, Naomi is supplied with all the things that she needs. In response to prayer, God richly rewards faithful people like Ruth and Boaz who demonstrate love and generosity, and in doing so become his instruments in helping the needy. Those are two major themes in this book that we've encountered so far. And there's a couple of others that maybe we'll talk about next week. Major themes. And as far as prayer and an answer to prayer, listen to this. In Ruth chapter 1 and verses 8 and 9, Naomi asked God to reward her daughters-in-law for their kindness and her sons, for their kindness to her and her sons by giving them new husbands. And the answer, we're not certain what happened to Orpah. She disappears from the story back in chapter 1, verse 14. But the Lord gave Ruth a new husband, Boaz. We see that in verses 10 through 13. If we were to look at Ruth chapter 2 and verse 12, there the prayer is, Boaz asked God to reward Ruth for her kindness to Naomi by providing her with protection and security. The answer? God answered this prayer through Boaz, who willingly fulfilled the role of family protector by marrying Ruth. In chapter 2, verses 19 and 20, the prayer there is that Naomi asked God to reward Boaz for his kindness to Ruth and to her family. The answer? God answered this prayer by giving Boaz a worthy wife who provided him with a child. We'll see that next week in verse 13. Ruth chapter 3 and verse 10, Boaz asked God to reward Ruth for her faithfulness to her deceased husband. The answer? God answered this prayer through Boaz, who married Ruth and provided her with a child. So throughout here, we see numerous prayers and answers, a reminder, perhaps written at a time in Israel's history where they needed a reminder that God answers prayers, that God has secured the line of David, that God hears, even when in dire circumstances as this, God is there. Be reminded of this. In verses 11 and 12, here, what we studied tonight, the people asked God to give Boaz offspring and to make him prosperous and famous. The answer? God answered this prayer by enabling Ruth to bear a son whom they will name Obed, who was the ancestor of the great King David. God very much does answer prayer. I mean, who would pay any attention to a widow who's lost everything and to a widowed Moabite woman trickling into a little town, little village called Bethlehem? I mean, who cares? God cares. That's who cares. There's no one too small. There's no one so insignificant, so little that escapes the notice of God. He cares for his people. And he supplies his people. Most often, he'll use other people to supply their needs. But every once in a while, he'll step in and do something completely unexpected to do it. That's God. That's our God. These are some of the things that we need to walk away with the book of Ruth, being reminded that our God cares. Though there are millions, hundreds of millions of believers on this earth, Peter is not insignificant, and God cares for him as much as he cares for all of us put together. That's our God. There's nothing too small, and there's nothing so great that he cannot do. Strong and so mighty. Remember that song? Any questions? Okay, we'll pick up verse 13. Try to get through. I'm sure we'll get through the rest of it next week. I hope this has been a blessing. We'll probably have a couple more themes, reminders, maybe, next week as well. Yes, ma'am.
Prayer request. The neighbors right down the road from us, they lost their grandson this weekend. He committed suicide at Slicker Rock.
Wow.
And straight-A student involved in sports. There was a ton of teens at this funeral today. He was not a loner,
Wow.
Yeah. But if you could just pray for Seth.
Seth's family.
Yeah. It's going to be.
Are they believers? Do you know? Do you know if they're believers?
I don't know. The whole family is Catholic.
Okay. Seth's family. Wow. Well, thank you for worshiping tonight. Let's bow in a word of prayer. Our God, we are small in this world.